everyone. Welcome. My name is Nathan Wood, and this is the ELECTRI webinar where we're focusing on improving project RFI efficiency and insights through a common data exchange. Quick, just about ELECTRI, for those who may not be familiar with ELECTRI. They are the foundation for electrical construction that was established in 1989 by the National Electrical Contractors Association, NECA, which is the voice of the $160 billion electrical construction industry. ELECTRI International works to help electrical contractors meet today's demands and tomorrow's challenges by funding, conducting, coordinating, and transforming research results into meaningful, useful education and consulting programs with practical publications. So I do want to give a special thanks to Joey Shorter, Executive Director, and Tim Moore Rosenden, who is the task force chair, as well as Tim Spino, and the rest of the task force committee for helping to bring this together. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests who are with us today. So first we have Chris Langiza, who is the Director of Business Development for Procore Technologies. Chris has been in the industry, been working together for almost a decade now, and both of us really share that people first mentality, doing some really interesting things with the app marketplace and integrations now over at Procore. So we'll be talking about that more in a second. So welcome, Chris. Next up, we have Matt Lamb, Chief Information Officer for Rosenden. Matt was very instrumental in us getting this report out, and his feedback was extremely helpful. So excited to have him on, and his background does come from both the general contractor's perspective as well as the electrical contractor. And last but not least, let's welcome Tom Stem, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Rivet. And we have been working together with Construction Progress Coalition for the last couple of years. And have had a lot of conversations about the future of open data exchanges and open interoperability in construction. So welcome, Tom. All right, so let's dive into our topic here of RFIs, or the request for information. I'm going to throw it to you, Chris, first. Can you just talk a little bit about, from your perspective, kind of why is RFI such a big topic that we've been trying to tackle for a couple of years now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nathan. And when you think about an RFI, I mean, what is it really? It's this. We need to get some information to actually perform the work that we're trying to do, right? Something was missing, something wasn't clear, and a lot of times those requests come with associated either increases in amount of time we need to do the work or the amount of cost that's associated with that. So these are big drivers on whether or not projects are finished on time, on budget, whether or not we sometimes make money on projects as well, because they are a factor in whether or not we get paid for some of these change orders associated with these questions that are asked because the information wasn't clear from the beginning. So, we've spent a lot of time in the industry trying to figure out things like how long does it take for us to actually turn around an RFI? What is the actual soft cost of an RFI? Like when we ask a question and all the processing that happens, the numbers tend to come in somewhere between the $1,200 to $1,500 range, depending on which report that you're reading, on the fact that every time you write an RFI and pass it across the whole process, it costs about $1,200 to $1,500, and that never really gets recuperated in the cost of the change order that's associated usually. So anything that we can do to expedite that process is going to be extremely beneficial for us. And I think that's why the industry has looked so closely at RFIs, and why we want to solve some of the pain around this is so that we can speed up that process and eliminate a lot of that cost associated with it.
Absolutely. And so as we go into the survey that we took of 144 ELECTRI members and their shared pains, they came back with, as you were just saying, Chris, the lack of standardization, the pains with the duplicate data entry and the waste that creates, just the time to manage those RFIs, as well as dealing with poor practices from external stakeholders and how do we measure that, and then ultimately the investment in software to get that data to make it valuable. And we've found this research in the past that talks about this $15.8 billion in waste due to this lack of interoperability. And so Matt, as a chief information officer, what of all of these I think are your biggest shared pains or pain points that you're facing in your position?
I think at the end of the day, all of them hit us in one form or another. But as we get on bigger jobs, more complicated work, we're finding a lot of time we're having to use software that the GC or owner is mandating in addition to our own standardized project management software. So that's duplicate data entry, that's tracking, RFIs in multiple systems. It's ultimately just a time suck and a time loss for managing all that process, documents in multiple places, etc. The communication just gets kind of broken.
Absolutely. And I think, Tom, that's a lot of where your background and not from construction, but from interoperability and this use of APIs. And I know last couple of years we've kind of played with what is a CDX or a common data exchange. And I think it was our conversation in your office of the idea of a USB plug and the fact that everybody kind of wants this consistent data and nice clean dashboards through a USB, but what we're really dealing with is more that everybody's got these different international kind of plug standards and our own standards and shared panes. And so I guess talk a little bit about, how you've been trying to address it, some of the shared pains, even from your perspective that you've seen in trying to get all this data connected.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, we live and work inside of the integration space all day, every day. And there's been historically a lot of debate around, what the data looks like and how the data is formed in order to make integration easier to perform, especially if you're talking about external systems. And so, all the way, dating all the way back to AGC XML and then the evolution of the Construction Open Standard Alliance, which is the next iteration of AGC XML, into CPC, what we're presenting here today, and the evolution of that work towards a CDX. It eliminates and attempts to position, more focus on best practices around how different stakeholders in the project, whether you're a trade contractor or a general contractor or an architect or even the owner, how those roles in the project can exchange data with one another and do so in a way that everyone has visibility to the things that they should see. So that they can have the most insight, the best information available to manage their own project, to manage their own next steps. And you'll start to eliminate a lot of the offline lack of visibility that occurs, whether it's through email or side conversations, things like that. So as we create transparency in the data profile, we become less concerned about the specifics of that data and how is that data structured, because now we can be more open in how we exchange that data, and we can translate that data across systems with a lot more speed. So it's really all about automation. How do we automate the exchange of information between roles on the project?
And we were talking earlier about this, about the in-between route that even just looking at this picture here, that all the Apple products, go through a proprietary exchange. I'm sure if it's Microsoft or if it's a Google Android product, it's going to have its own, at some point, proprietary exchanges. And I think you had some interesting thoughts on kind of that balance between the need for proprietary ecosystem exchanges, but ultimately the same open data, so we can have that unrefined oil at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been too much historical focus on specifically looking at the fields, for example, on an RFI. Does this technology platform expose this field, and do the specific statuses that it lets the user use, are they consistent with what we think the standard should be? And so we want to move away from forcing every technology provider to conform to a universal model, because the pace of adoption and availability to conform to that model is going to be really slow. And instead, we want to really create an understanding that says, I think the status field, we're going to kind of focus on that in the conversation today, because it's a great example of being able to illustrate the impact of a CDX and why a CDX is important. Because as you look at these ecosystems develop around technology, we can now create a far more uniform method of exchanging information between ecosystems. So a great example, Chris, is with Procore. Procore is building an open ecosystem of technology, right? They're at marketplace. There's dozens of participants in that marketplace. And so they're creating this open ecosystem for data exchange through their marketplace and through their public API. That allows sort of any technology player to communicate with Procore by exchanging information through that API. But there's other ecosystems that exist, right? So you might have an ecosystem with Autodesk or an ecosystem with Trimble. And so if if a electrical contractor, for instance, sits inside of one of those ecosystems, they might be able to get their systems to communicate with one another, but now the question becomes, how do we span ecosystems? How does a Procore ecosystem talk to an Autodesk ecosystem, or how does a Trimble ecosystem talk to a Procore ecosystem? And that's where the CDX concept starts to really pay dividends to the industry, because as we establish standards for workflow, best practices around when to inform an electrical contractor that the status has shifted for the architect, things like that, we start to eliminate the need for such significant investment in integration, because those integrations become far more accessible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but at the end of the day, there is some minimal level of standards that is required. So as we go into these 5 shared panes, looking at the first one of discovering what standards do exist. So we mentioned earlier the AGC XML, and Tom, I know this is even before your time, but you're a little bit closer to the history of this than I am. Can you explain a little bit of kind of the original intention of the AGC XML RFI standard back in 2009?
Yeah, you know, the original intent was to address, you know, the shared pains that we're talking about today, frankly. So it was really, and it was an initiative that was funded. It was organized around trying to take a technology perspective to the RFI workflow, and how we can now establish a standard for how the data is structured and exchanged between technology providers. I think what we've learned since AGC XML has evolved into what we're talking about here today and presenting here today with this report that we've produced around standardization of the RFI workflow. You know, AGC XML evolved into a framework that was referred to as COSA. I was the executive director for a while, and what we learned in that association was it was really technology talking to technology, that we were missing the industry perspective. And so AGC XML kind of took a couple of things and ultimately lacked adoption because it tried to use a very specific technology to illustrate the standard XML. And at that point in time, that might have been modern, but it didn't really span time very well. And so it wasn't future-proof from that perspective. And so adoption's been low. It was also technology talking to technology in a way that it was trying to force uniformity across technology, meaning it wanted every technology provider to provide an API that looked the same. And what we know and what we realize is that the way Procore works is going to be different than the way BIM 360 works, is going to be different than the way that AConnex works, is going to be different than, et cetera. And so we needed an exchange framework, hence CDX, that allows those systems, those technology providers, to be different and unique in the way that they serve their customers. But we still needed to standardize the method of exchange between those systems. And so that's when we really get into the same set of data, and the taxonomy of the data is less important in terms of specifically how it's organized, and more important in terms of how we provide meaning to that taxonomy from a workflow perspective. And so it kind of leads to this this tiering mechanism that's on the screen right now.
Yeah, and so just to quickly go through this, what all we're doing here is taking the original AGC XML data fields and applying some classification as far as tier 0, just that it's your basic kind of company and project information, versus tier 1 being kind of the issue related question and answer, versus the tier 2 being the formal response, and tier 3 being any cost and schedule impact. And 2 fields that were added since then, the ball and court field that's been popular with project management solutions, and also the PCO, the potential change order number, so we can start tracking that true cost impact. So really, again, the same fundamental taxonomy that's been around, and just trying to apply that in more interesting ways through integration and through open APIs. So this gets into how we can solve the duplicate data entry in our second shared pane. So real quick, back to some survey responses from our 144 ELECTRI members, seeing that still quite a few, 102 responding that they're using Excel or Word or PDF templates to send their RFI documentation, most likely through email. 63 that responded with project managers that were not following typical protocol or using the standard system and quote going rogue. And then those that are using and requiring the project management system, 56 of those are required to use the GC system, whereas 48 of them have their own. So a lot of those conditions where we're facing the challenge of duplicate data entry if both sides require that data to be entered. So I think the idea here is to address this non-standardization by standardizing the integration between them. But I think just to clarify, Matt, we were talking earlier, we're not saying that you shouldn't use Excel, but that there should be certain levels of standards to an Excel, right?
Yeah, the fact that anyone's using Word, Excel, PDF as templates, fine, it fits their business model. But as we start to grow and get more integrated, I think we can provide more value by using systems or integrating Excel and PDF forms into the bigger picture of tying in with either internal systems or external systems with GCs, architects, etc. And they'll really get benefit there.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing more platforms like an eSub or a TriBuild or a Plexus or others that are trying to cater to small, medium businesses and specifically trade contractors. So more than likely it's only a matter of time before we start to move over to them. But yeah, certainly not saying that Excel is a bad thing, but it does need that standard structure to it. Also survey feedback, looking at what were some of the main platforms that are being used when it's being required. So looking at what project management software the electrical contractor is using, you see sort of the usual suspects of Procore, Viewpoint, PlanGrid, eSub, Prolog, and then some other kind of more generic Smartsheet and Office 365 versus the general contractors or the project owners, the clients to the electrical, using a Procore or Bluebeam or Aconex was another popular one, in addition to Prolog, eBuilder, and others. So at the top of the list is essentially the Procore to Procore. If anyone was at the Groundbreak keynote and the discussions around really the need for that sort of an integration is certainly at the top of the list for electrical contractors as well. But for those that are maybe kind of less familiar with what this shared pane is, let's take a second to go into kind of the mechanics of it. If you've got your electrical contractor on the left versus your general contractor on the right, and let's just say the general contractor is using Procore and the electrical is using Prolog by Trimble. And that shared pane is that currently that integration so that you can do your work in one and have it show up in the other doesn't exist. So a lot of times what will end up happening is that the electrical contractor's project manager or whoever's writing those RFIs will just use the extension of the system into the GC's Prolog, which is certainly efficient for that project manager. But Matt, from your perspective, from a CIO, what are kind of the risks or challenges with that?
We have a couple different things. As I mentioned earlier, it's duplicate data entry and where's the data stored? So in this model where the electrical contractor is logging into the GC's system of record, all the data is being stored in the GC system of record. We have nothing on our side to go back to, either for historical data. I mean, I hate to say it, but you start getting in things on the job start going south, whatever, you need to have your own data to keep track and mitigate issues. We want to look at it for starting to do more analytics on data, on projects in real time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And in this model, it's duplicate data entry, and that becomes the issue.
Exactly. Yeah. And so how can we avoid the duplicate data entry, but also, have that data? And so I think that's where this world of APIs that has evolved from the XML is really interesting. And I mean, Chris, you've been living in this world for a while, but, coming from industry. So like, how do you articulate to folks really kind of what an API is and the value of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, having to explain to executives and CEOs and longtime construction professionals what an API is, I mean, it stands for Application Programming Interface, right? But what does that really mean? If you kind of relate it back to, like, think if you're in a restaurant, right, and you're trying to order dinner, you're the customer, you're trying to get something to eat, right? And then you have a chef that's back in the kitchen that's actually trying to cook your food, right? Now, how do you get your information, like what you want to eat, over to the chef so that they can actually make it. And that's where the waiter comes in. So the waiter kind of acts as a way of an API. They take your order, they ask you what it is that you want, what you're requesting. They take that order to the chef. The chef then prepares that order, does what they need to on their system or in their kitchen. And then the waiter brings that food back to you and delivers it back to you. So if you think about that in the form of information, so when someone says, hey, I really need to get this information from another system, they make that API call, and it goes over to that other system, prepares that data in the other system, and then retrieves that information and brings it back to the user. And that's really what it is. It allows these systems to talk to each other in a way that necessarily doesn't require a standardized format, but it just ensures that we can get the information in and out very easily.
And one of the simplest ways, I mean, how long have superintendents and project management complaining about having, one password and not having all these different logins, and essentially this open authorization or the ability to log in to other systems with, a Procore or a BIM 360 is just one of many examples of the efficiencies that APIs can bring. Awesome. So as we go into our third shared pane of managing the multiple RFI logs, this will go into the discussion that all of us were in Anaheim at the AEC Next conference, really talking about how do we translate the differences in standards between an electrical contractor and that project client. And so, just because we have the data standard of the AGC XML, and the exchange language now that's much more sophisticated with APIs, we still have that third step of the interoperability requirements. And Tom, we've certainly collaborated to come up with these 3 steps. Can you kind of break down what those 3 steps are that make up the CDX interoperability requirements?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that we wanted to do and needed to do is to really start to standardize the definition of a role on a project. And then kind of break that down to the individual, right? So a role on the project would be more at the company level. Are you the electrical contractor? Are you the architect? Are you the general contractor? And then within their teams, what are the roles that those individuals are performing, whether you're the project manager or the engineer or what have you, right? And so as we thought about that, we needed to make sure that from an exchange perspective, that we provide access to move that data, but we also provide visibility into that data as that data is being moved between these different roles on the project. So we came up with this authenticate, authorize, trigger method of articulating how that happens, where at the individual level, the project manager for the electrical contractor can authenticate to that CDX. Maybe it's via the system that they're using, or maybe it's not, but based on the role of the project that they're representing for their company, they're then authorized to maybe submit data. They can send that RFI over to the general contractor if they're the one originating the RFI, and they might be authorized to see certain updates made to that RFI profile as it's being workflowed from the general contractor to the architect, to see that the general contractor made the ball and court of that RFI now the architect. And so they can now have visibility, and they're authorized to have visibility into certain updates during the workflow. And so then it gets into that triggering concept. What are the things that happen to that data, and any of the specific systems that these different roles are using to manage their own internal RFI process that would trigger the data to exchange, right? So if I'm the project manager at the electrical contractor, I can authenticate to the CDX. I'm authorized to submit an RFI, and maybe the trigger is that I put my ball in court assignment and my use of eSub to the project engineer that I'm working with at the general contractor, which would then allow that RFI data to flow into that project engineer's use of Procore on behalf of that general contractor role. And as the general contractor in their system puts the ball in court to the architect, then that might trigger the exchange of the RFI data from that Procore system and that project engineer's use of the Procore system over into the architect's use of Newforma, and vice versa. So as the authentication occurs at the individual level, they're authorized based on their role on their project to trigger certain types of data flow, and also have visibility into the different triggers that are occurring between the roles on the project.
Yeah, and just to apply a little bit more to that, you know, the first step there of authenticate would be to, again, identify which of those fields matter. And probably in this case, you would want to select ball and court as you were discussing, because that's a really critical field there, but identifying which of those fields matter. But then when we do have kind of some of those differences in what I call an RFI or what you call an RFI, I mean, Chris, talk a little bit about kind of some of the discussions and those conclusions that we came to in Anaheim when it came to how we deal with this sort of interoperability mess.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that the challenges that we have is we all have different definitions of the same thing, and we all have different perspectives on them. So you know, one thing to think about is things like status, right? And I think you know, us having a different perspective on whether or not an RFI is opened or closed between a GC and a subcontractor, or an owner and a general contractor for that matter, is very important, right? We all have our own view into it. So what we may choose to put in one field may be very different than what someone else chooses to put in that field. And I'll give the example, I think we're going to show this a little bit later, of an idea of status, which is, hey, we have a RFI that gets asked to the design team. They come back with a response. At first blush, the GC looks at that RFI and it looks like it is pretty solid from a perspective of a response. So they go ahead and close that RFI and send it back to the subcontractor. Well, maybe the electrical subcontractor gets that RFI back and then they realize, hey, this can't actually be done because it doesn't comply with code. We need a different answer. So the GC has closed that RFI, but the sub doesn't feel that it's closed, and we have this discrepancy, right? So we need to have the ability to kind of have multiple statuses and to be able to communicate those statuses up and down the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think, Matt, as we were talking about before, that's a little bit of the nuance in that every project's a little bit different, every contract's a little bit different. So how you define what's open and what's closed is certainly conversation.
Yeah, it's a conversation that needs to happen both in person and electronically, right? So I think part of the early conversation needs to happen between the trade contractor and the GC, and even the GC and the design team, is, you know, what are definitions of these things? You know, we spent a lot of time talking about what contractual requirements are for when an RFI needs to be returned. You know, it needs to be returned within 5 business days or 7 business days, whatever the status, or, you know, whatever's decided upon. But simultaneously, when you talk about what the definition of closed is, it should be after the response is accepted. And then also we need to look at the software when we start building these APIs and start leveraging some intelligence in them, that it comes back as, you know, as this graphic shows, returned. Well, it's returned for me, and then I should have X amount of time to kick it back to the GC to say, no, this isn't actually answered for any particular reason. As Chris mentioned, you know, it's not code compliant, whatever it is, and then it kind of reopens back. All that workflow needs to really be vetted out amongst us and amongst the individual project teams as they, you know, come across these.
Yeah, and I feel like going into these weeds really opens up the opportunity for kind of gamification and changing how we measure the RFI to ultimately both reduce the response times as well as reduce the overall number of them as a whole based on how we measure them. So that's awesome. But the last discussion here of the trigger that, you know, Tom was hitting on a little bit earlier, and I've certainly come to understand better of, you know, what initiates some sort of an automated exchange from one platform to another. And the report goes into detail by just looking at the open API documentation of a plan grid and a Procore of what can be exchanged, but really identifying, is that trigger happening, you know, at the point of leaving the plan grid or at the point of being accepted into Procore, and if that's done internally, you know, or sorry, if it's done externally from the contractor to another general contractor, or is it done internally where it's maybe a field superintendent that is sending that back to their own internal manager that may again change the rules or change those data requirements. But that's a direct trigger. The other opportunity would be sort of that indirect or a middleware where we're doing more kind of manipulation and more sophisticated translations and transformations of the data. And really, I think that's Tom where Rivet's trying to come in and identify where those are needed. And so what are kind of the most often cases where you're kind of brought in to help connect different platforms?
Yeah, I think we're brought in often when maybe there's a need to really streamline visibility into that exchange process. If you have a complex authentication model, aka how is the user of that electrical authenticating in their use of ESUB, but then also in their use of Procore, things like that. There are some complexities that we need to streamline to make a CDX available to smaller businesses that might not have the no offense, Matt, but you guys are a really large contractor in a way that you have more resources available to make some of these connections happen on behalf of your performance and the projects that you perform. Not every company would have that ability to do that on their own. So a system like Rivet is in a position to help productize the experience, but then also enforce some of the visibility that we seek. Even if you kind of maybe go back for a second to the previous slide, I think it kind of helps illustrate the point for me, Nathan. But when we kind of talk about triggering and authorization, Matt kind of touched on it, Chris kind of touched on it. There is a need to customize every project because the participants in that project are going to be different most of the time. And so they need to sit down and in just the same way that you would negotiate a contract, you need to kind of negotiate the way that the information will flow in terms of what happens if you return the RFI to me as the electrical contractor and I need to reopen it. How long do I have to do that, et cetera. So a CDX and someone like Rivet that would sit in the middle and power a CDX can provide the transparency that each of these roles on the project seek. So how does the electrical contractor, you see those like notify EC, diagrams there in the middle, like how do they get guaranteed that they're going to see those notices? And then how do you measure performance of the architecture engineer, the design team, that they are taking less than 10 days to turn around a response when it does hit their system, things like that. We've heard a lot of our clients will struggle because of the duplicate data entry that they have to perform. If they forget to enter the RFI into the architect system, that clock doesn't start appropriately. And so when they need a 10-day turnaround, it just turned into 20-day turnaround because they forgot to log in and do it. And so you can start to establish more guarantee around the exchange of information, more visibility in the exchange of that information. And then you can also make it more configurable on a project by project basis because you can set up the preferences that the participants in that project might have that represent these various roles.
Well, and I think that's where it's interesting because whether the electrical is using an ESUB or in this case, it could be using a Procore, and we're doing the Procore to Procore. The idea is that you could have a direct Procore to Procore, or you could have an indirect Procore to Procore, depending on that relationship between those two parties. And as you mentioned, Tom, Rosendin is a large enough company that you may decide at some point that you have your own kind of internal middleware that you do these exchanges and let projects decide if they're going to use Procore or other apps as the project management side, but you own the data, which is sort of an interesting concept that I think, I don't know if you brought it up or if I brought it up, Matt. But at any rate, so continuing on, so we make sure we get plenty of time for questions. So let's move on to the fourth one, which is how we deal with those poor practices from the external stakeholders, the things that are more or less out of our control, which again, what gets measured gets managed. So how do we change the way we measure to improve and reduce those RFIs? Chris mentioned before some of the stats that are out and published of certainly the cost and the delay impacts and really just the percentage of RFIs that never even get responded to, just the lack of communication that happens in this industry and the impacts on productivity and quality because of it. So certainly our pitch on this is that by measuring the good RFIs and trying to and also measuring the bad RFIs and reducing those, we can start to transform this industry, start to move things earlier so that we are having less formal tier 2 and cost impact tier 3 RFIs, and they're more just that tier 1 issue coordination type aspect that happens in the world of BIM and virtual design and construction. So as we go through basically the conclusions on how we need to measure this is just coming up with a couple standards here of impact, as well as the impact tier that we just talked about, as well as the phase in which it's happening. So, I think we need to be measuring not just how many RFIs, but how many RFIs are happening in which phase. Is it before that electrical has been released for fabrication and delivery, or is it while it's out in the field? And so knowing those and measuring those as part of the data standard that's listed there is really critical for us to move things forward. And then the third one there being the duration. So how long did it take for each of those RFIs to get responded to, as the guys were talking about earlier, and how does that show up in a dashboard so that we can be more predictive about that and less reactive. So, okay, so as we go into the last one here, I think it's clear that we need to be adopting technology and adopting data standards and helping that improve our RFI process. But we really need to make sure that it makes sense from a return on investment standpoint. So just to start off, quickly some stats on the $10 billion that have been invested by venture capital funds into construction technology, producing, as we said before, so many new solutions that are going to come out. So there's only going to be more choices that are going to have to talk to each other, and many of those choices only do one or two use cases, like daily reports or safety. And so how do we recognize if they're the best tool for that solution? That's great, but they need to be talking to a more central platform where we're trying to aggregate all that data, and that's really the importance of the CDX, because I think as we've been understanding and learning as an industry, and some of the messaging that we're sending as Construction Progress Coalition, is that this technology change is not just one technology tipping point. There's sort of multiple different tipping points that are creating this. And so the technology, the API, or this interoperability is just step one. So we need individuals that are comfortable adopting it and understand it. We need business models that support it, as Tom was talking about. And then ultimately, what is the public policy's role in almost requiring some of this when it comes to maybe financial reporting or other things that will really drive that adoption. So as we go into the red zone analysis of, should you or should you not invest in API integrations and connecting RFI data, it really comes down to a breakdown of capability, cost, and buy-in. So starting with capability, looking at, what are the data exchange requirements, and, can that technology meet those requirements? So with that list of the top used or most used platforms by electrical contractors on the left column, and the general contractors up on the top, you can see there's sort of a matrix with a legend here of what we found as far as existing either direct or indirect API integrations that are available, and what tier of RFI data are they able to pass? Is it just basic tier 1 question and answer? Is it tier 2 formal design responses, or is it tier 3 that cost and schedule impact? So as Chris kindly informed me, our September 9th date was already outdated, as some of these are changing fast. So we'll make sure and keep this graphic updated as more capabilities for this open interoperability come together, and really helping the customer choose from all these capabilities which one makes sense for them.
Yeah,
so
I think.
Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say that I think what that really speaks to is how quickly this landscape is changing, and how the technology companies out there, Procore and others, are really embracing the idea that we need to have ways for our customers to integrate. I know personally, like, that's a big passion of mine, so that's why I'm here. And we want to knock all those names off the list, and really help from owner all the way down to sub, streamline this process.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, looking forward to continuing that forward. But and to do these, it doesn't cost nothing. Certainly coding is very expensive, and software engineers are very expensive. And so, in order to make the business model work, we have to really make sure that we can kind of calc out that cost. And so a lot of times, especially when it comes to technology adoption and construction, the best way to kind of calculate an ROI is to actually kind of go backwards and say, all right, what is the cost of doing nothing? And, Matt, we've talked about in the past how I think you've sometimes had to calc out just some rough calculations on just the waste that gets created in these different steps by not having the integration in order to kind of prove the value of investing in these integrations, right?
Yeah, I've done these kind of ROI calcs on, previous company. We built an integration between two PM systems to avoid duplicate data entry, and the ROI came out with some insane number. I mean, it was, I don't know, $10,000 a week or something like that we were able to theoretically recoup, because I think, as Chris said earlier, it costs what, $1,500 to write an RFI. Well, if everyone's doing it multiple times, look at what that costs on a job amongst all the different parties to do it, and the amount of time we could be spending on designing the project better, building it better, taking on new tasks. I mean, there's just a lot of direct and indirect waste that occurs throughout this process. So I think if we're able to tighten it up as an industry, focus on both reducing the number of RFIs as well as reducing the time we spend on doing the ones we actually need to do, I think we'd see a pretty dramatic change.
Absolutely. And then I think what becomes interesting, especially in this industry, we were talking earlier about the difference between an internal integration, like I think your example, Matt, might have been, project management to project management within your company. But if we're talking about, exchanging with externally between an electrical contractor and a GC, that buy-in becomes, even more difficult to obtain. But I think using that same strategy of the calculations, it becomes even easier to show just the obvious benefits of all the time savings when you add both the time savings for the electrical and the general contractor together, and look at, okay, the hard cost of developing that API middleware, and as Tom was saying before, kind of the need for that requirements development and that sort of workshop to put together those rules and those triggers. That's a small chunk of change compared to the potential value. And sometimes it just takes doing that calculation to convince the powers that be to move forward with it. Because it seems like, Tom, that it's from all intents and purposes, as long as the capabilities of the open API are there, it's pretty easy to connect this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing that sort of gets underrated and what we're trying to illustrate with this type of a calculation is, everybody sort of implies labor as a sunk cost, but the opportunity cost around delays, you forgot to enter that RFI into the architect system, and 10 days go by and the clock didn't start. And so now you got to get that clock started. And so the hard costs versus the soft costs and understanding those, I think, is a critical component to this for the industry to kind of show up and participate in this type of a solution that we're presenting, really, in terms of how technology can support improvement and efficiency inside of delivery of a project. When an RFI is required inside of a project, how do we process that as efficiently as we can? Automating as much of that as possible through technology, I think, is there's a lot of leverage and return on investment from that perspective. And we've been able to prove that out in every single scenario we've supplied this type of outcome for our customer base, absolutely. But one of the things that gets understated, I think, for the industry at large is some of that opportunity and soft cost and the cost of delay, and really starting to understand the cost of an RFI as Chris alluded. Average RFI costs $1,200 to $1,500 per project. How does that add up, especially as the projects get big?
Yeah, and I think part of the way we're trying to help add that up, this is a sort of zoom in of our CDX playbook that shows I think it's like 23 different exchanges, either sending or receiving, some of which are analog kind of human readable exchanges versus digital machine readable exchanges. And each one of those, comes at some level of inefficiency, some level of cost, and certainly very critical data that's exchanged at each of those points. So, to really look at and break down, when is it happening, which phase, who are those stakeholders that are involved, how are they sharing the data together, whether it's document-based or kind of database or platform to platform. We talked about analog versus digital, and then of those 25 fields, who needs what data when is documented below. And then ultimately, where are those translations, the translations of the statuses or of the RFI numbers are all documented on the left here. So this is really kind of as you download the report and when it releases in a couple weeks here, you will see kind of the breakdown of how this is put together, what those questions are that are being asked, and how you can create one of these for your own project, and really identify if those if the RFI data fields that you need to exchange kind of are capable, and how to do that through APIs. So I do want to thank all of our guests here, Chris, Tom, Matt. It was an awesome discussion. I did see, I think we have a couple questions that came up. So let me pull up here. So the first one here from Steve: what can be done to eliminate the need for an RFI? Elimination of RFIs is much more effective than figuring out how to manage them. So Chris, we've had this debate quite a few times. You want to take this one on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that we can do in the industry to try and eliminate those RFIs. I know that we internally have done some research on like how many RFIs that get asked are actually somewhere in the drawings and somewhere already in the information, right? And also like how many RFIs are asked on every single job, right? That we could just prompt before the project even starts to ask that question, right? And RFIs aren't necessarily a bad thing. I think RFIs are a good thing. It's just when they happen later in the project, the more that you get into a project, the more costly they become. Asking RFIs and questions during the pre-construction and the design phase, pre-con RFIs, is a very healthy process because you're still defining what it is you're going to build. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done here, and a lot of people I think that are working on projects like these, using the information, using the data that we finally centrally sourced in places to automatically identify some of those type of questions that should get asked, so they get asked before you actually put the first shovel in the ground. And I think that's the real drive, is get those questions asked earlier. If we can streamline the process that they're not so difficult to handle, the likelihood of them actually having cost impact on a project is much, much lower.
Yeah, I think just, framing the context of what we even define an RFI to be, because I know they certainly come with a stigma.
Yeah, I'll just kind of quickly add to that, Nathan, just to say that really what the CDX and what we're putting forth with this report is organized around increasing and expanding collaboration inside of a project between the stakeholders and the roles inside of the project. So as you increase transparency, as you increase collaboration, kind of backed up by that transparency, you're going to get a lot of efficiency in a way that maybe prevention and elimination of the RFI is less important moving forward. As Chris notes, like as you increase transparency, increase collaboration, maybe getting those RFIs identified is actually a benefit to the project, because the earlier you identify them, the more efficient you can be. So the CDX is really organized around trying to provide efficiency, but with collaboration and transparency in mind, backed by as much automation as can be provided by the technology partners that are involved in the project based on those roles, use of that technology. So I just wanted to kind of amplify that a little bit in terms of CDX and why we're presenting the CDX in the way that we are. It's really about increasing collaboration and transparency, so that it's not about eliminating the RFI per se, but getting that identified as early as possible so that you can collaborate on it.
So we have another very timely question. I'll throw this to Chris. So Stefan asks if there is a new format to Procore integration.
Yeah, and a new format to Procore integration does exist. I think they're about in GA right now. I know that Tom actually worked on this project as well. It's expanding functionality, but focuses on RFIs and actually submittals as well, allowing for general contractors that are working on project with design teams to be able to pass that information between those two systems. Tom, happy to have you expand on that any more as you'd like as well.
Yeah, so the new format of Procore integration is really presented from the new forma customer's experience in terms of how that integration gets initiated. But as Chris notates, it's really that architect or the design team exchange with the GC. So when you look at that leg of the workflow, we've established automation between Procore and new forma on behalf of those two roles in the project. And so as we, those two roles are authorized now between those two systems to exchange data, and the triggers are well defined in terms of, what is the architect doing in new forma to trigger a response to go automatically into Procore to feed that response back into Procore, so the GC now has visibility into that response and then can manage their workflow beyond that data exchange. So that integration is available and is becoming available, and a GA announcement will be made very soon.
Yeah, and just to go back to the playbook and explain that some example is, if it is the architect or engineer over here on the left side, that would be kind of this 4-step integration process with the general contractor and Procore. But looking at the electrical contractor's perspective, they may want to see updates from that exchange, but they're most likely not going to be using new format. They're going to be using something else. So it just, again, gets back to why we need this universal CDX exchange. Awesome. So I think that was it for the questions. Before I go into our next steps, any last thoughts, Chris, Matt, or Tom, as we wrap this conversation up?
No, nothing for me.
Cool. So
nothing for me.
Yeah, so again, as a reminder, you can download this full report. So someone asked a question about having the recordings. The recording, as well as the full 50-some-odd page report with all of these graphics and figures and explanations within it, will be available on the electri.org website for download starting November 13th. We'll send another email reminder when that goes out. If you do want to start kind of diving in and looking at the sample CDX playbook that we've created for RFIs, you can go to, it's a bit.ly, so bit.ly/RFI-CDX, and it'll ask you to create a Lucid chart account, is what we use to generate those playbooks and do provide any feedback that you have. So you can learn about the other common data exchange initiatives that we do have going on by going to constructionprogress.org/common-data-exchange. And then if you are on the software side and interested in submitting your RFI integration or API endpoints for CDX certification, we are just now starting that process. So you can send an email to cdx@constructionprogress.org, and we will follow up with you there. As well as industry, if you are interested, especially ELECTRI members, definitely want to reach out and support your ability to communicate RFI standards, communicate RFI integrations, and adopt these new exciting workflows that will start to support progress in the industry.